Welcome back. This is Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. episode 102084. And this is going to be interesting because for this installment, we're talking about an episode that I don't particularly care for. Let me clarify before I go on. I don't think this is a bad episode. It's not a horrible hour of television or anything like that, and I've certainly seen much worse. But I do think it's representative of a lot of the problems this show experienced in the early goings when they were still in the working the kinks out phase. Villain of the week, MacGuffin of the week, very little advancement in the narrative, and no Marvel characters outside of that cameo at the end. Now, once again, they try to compensate for this by throwing in tons and tons of references to the movies and the comics. The plane is called S.H.I.E.L.D. 616. Coulson getting stabbed in the Avengers, Thor's hammer, Tesseract technology, Captain America, gamma radiation. They even figured out that they can mention Hydra as long as they're talking about it in a historical context. So again, they're really working overtime to reference Marvel as much as they possibly can, almost to the point where it feels like them overcompensating. Anyway, this is pretty commonly viewed as the weakest episode of Season 1. And I don't know if I agree with that necessarily, but I don't argue with it. It's also the point where Joss Whedon took a step back from the series in order to focus on making Avengers Age of Ultron, and the show-running duties officially passed to Jed Whedon, Marissa Tancaron, and Jeff Bell. Coincidence? Possibly. I think with Joss moving over to the Avengers, there was a bit of a ripple effect. Jed and Marissa are first-time showrunners, so they might have been learning on a curve for a little while. But that's not to say this episode is without merit. And unlike the pilot, this one was pretty much what I expected it to be. Whedon shows tend to follow a certain formula when they're starting out. They begin with a bunch of standalone episodes to let the viewers get to know the world and the characters, and then the larger story sort of kicks in later on. That's what I thought 084 would be, and that's what it was. And because, unlike the pilot, I didn't have really big expectations and didn't think they'd drop a ton of story on me all at once, I think that's why I'm a bit kinder to this episode than a lot of other fans, even though I acknowledge this is not one of the stronger episodes they produced in the first season. And another thing you really have to be mindful of with Whedon shows, even if this is more of a Jed Whedon / Marvel show, they're always very good at doing standalone episodes that don't seem very significant at the time, but which end up tying into the narrative in ways that you don't necessarily see coming. And that's what I was thinking as I watched 084. That it might not have seemed that way at the time, but through this admittedly fairly generic plot, they were probably feeding the audience some type of information that was going to become important later. So if we're approaching it in that sense, how does 084 hold up? Let's find out. And yes, there will be spoilers. The newly formed team, which is not getting along, is called in to investigate a mysterious science machine discovered in Peru, and in the process get caught up in a dispute between a band of rebels and the local government represented by an old flame of Coulson's, conveniently enough. They all end up on the plane, all hell breaks loose as they start to fight over the device, and the agents manage to put a stop to this, learning a valuable lesson in teamwork in the process. Along the way, we have our requisite hashtag for the trailer moment, as well as some pretty nifty foreshadowing. The 084 weapon was introduced, which, instead of being a throwaway plot device, would actually come back later on in a very memorable moment in the season finale. Coulson explaining to Skye what an 084 is. Object of unknown origin. Kinda like you. Those sneaky-ass writers. They were explaining exactly what Skye was to the audience and nobody realized it. But my favorite bit of foreshadowing here was the book that Ward was reading. The book, he said, was given to him by his SO, John Garrett. Matterhorn, a book about, among other things, soldiers getting killed by members of their own platoon that they shouldn't have trusted. See, from the very beginning, they were dropping hints about the Ward heel turn, but they were so subtle that nobody picked up on them until after the fact. Very nicely done with that show. Visually, I think the episode is a bit hit and miss. There were a few visual effects shots that were probably not all that they could be. Seriously, was that the best green screen you had? But the climax when they blow a hole in the side of the plane and everything is being sucked out due to decompression is pretty harrowing until the admittedly hokey moment at the end when Skye plugs the hole with a life raft. Story-wise, it's pretty basic, nothing too noteworthy here, with the villain being kind of obvious. But to the character's credit, they figure that out almost as quickly as the audience does, and it's mostly action from there. But what this episode is mainly focused on is the character interaction, which tends to be one of this show's strengths. Ward and Skye aren't getting along, Ward and Fitzsimmons aren't getting along, May is not really communicating with anyone, but in the end they manage to come to an understanding and work together to resolve the crisis. So we have what amounts to a big team-building exercise here. More than anything, it's a character development episode, and after several members of the cast got shortchanged in the pilot in that regard, I think something like that was warranted, and having a really complex plot would have detracted from that in my opinion. The thing is, most of that development was devoted to Ward and Skye, who, at this stage of the game, were probably the least popular characters in the fan community as I understand it, which I think may be part of the reason why some people aren't crazy about this episode. Although, I enjoy Skye more here than I did in the pilot. She was less like super awesome hacker girl, and more like just a street-smart fish out of water, and I thought she was a lot more likable as a result. Once again, May and Fitzsimmons don't get a lot to do, unfortunately. We do get a few little tidbits about May, but nothing major. But I did like how they started building on Coulson's characterization from the Avengers, how he's a big fanboy and really into S.H.I.E.L.D. history and collectibles and gadgets and things like that. It makes Coulson more relatable. Gee, I wonder if this is supposed to be a gateway character for the comic fans. The only really big, glaring problem I had here was the use of Nick Fury. He shows up in the Stinger just to chew Coulson out about the plane getting damaged and to set up a joke about a fish tank of all things. And that's it. Really? Sure, it's funny, but you've got Samuel L. Jackson for one scene, and that's what you do with him? A quick little bit done just for laughs? I'm sorry, but that always felt like a mistake to me. In my opinion, and that's all it is, if you're gonna bring in any Marvel character, let alone a super important one like Fury, it should be a meaningful, memorable appearance, or just don't do it at all. You'll just cheapen it. Now, they would get much, much better about this later on, but to this day, I still think they should have taken Fury out of this episode and put him in the pilot instead. As it is, the first time Nick Fury showed up on Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. kind of felt wasted, I'm sorry to say. So in the end, we have kind of an unmemorable villain of the week that we'll most likely never see again, a rather generic plot, and a cameo whose potential was, frankly, squandered. But we also have some good character development for the team. The Skye Ward ship was unofficially launched, love it or hate it. Watch out, you two! Iceberg 15 episodes dead ahead! We're introduced to the 084 concept, which would become a huge plot point in the future, and some important seeds were planted that would pay off later on, just subtly enough that we didn't know that's what they were doing at the time. So that's 084. And to be honest, I really don't think it's that bad. I agree it's not perfect, and like many others, I was kind of unimpressed when it first aired, but looking back on it now, knowing the stuff it was setting up, I appreciate it more for the things it did well, rather than dislike it for the things it needed to improve upon. Thanks everyone for watching. Next up is episode 103 of Season 1, The Asset. Our first Skye-centric episode of the season. I'm as excited as you are. I'll see you then.